guess it's time for for Kara Graves to come up and talk about State of the Spectrum. And I encourage you to read Kara's biography. She's highly accomplished in the spectrum world, and she's a partner at Wilkinson Barker. Welcome aboard, Kara. Thanks for coming.
So hi, everybody. Kara Graves. I'm a partner at Wilkinson Barker Knauer in Washington, D.C. I'm actually based out of Richmond now, but I had the pleasure of coming up and speaking with everybody today. We had, I think, a great conversation just next door on a lot of the good themes that we'll see in terms of the overall spectrum landscape and some of the updates we'll talk about today. But I think in terms of kind of what I was hoping to speak about today is, if I can get my theme. What am I doing here? Oh, I don't think my clicker works. Sorry. Oh, okay, I touched it. That worked. Oh, there we go. Loose USB. Lots of similar themes as last year. Sorry about that for the jump start there. Lots of similar themes as last year, but I do want to make sure to give the overview of any changes that we've had from the lead agencies involved, the FCC, NTIA, and then the variety of other players who are sort of taking leadership roles in the spectrum space. I do want to touch on the National Spectrum Strategy and give everybody an overview of the 4 pillars that are in there and some of the key timelines that we'll see really from now until about 2027 is what the plan is for that strategy. We will go through band-specific developments. You'll see that I'm going to organize that in order of band, just so that we can kind of logically go up the frequencies. So we'll start with low band, go through mid, and touch on some high band frequencies as well. And then just a few other spectrum some related proceedings and other just notable FCC actions that I wanted to make sure that the group was aware of as well. So in terms of the current FCC, this time last year, we were still waiting for our 5th commissioner. We finally now have a full dais at the FCC. Ana Gomez was confirmed back in September of 2023 after a 32-month vacancy at the FCC for that 5th commissioner. So full dais now. Commissioners Carr and Starks were also reconfirmed at the same time. So we now have the commissioners serving their each terms ending in successive years, starting actually with this year. Commissioner Symington's term is the next one up to expire. But I would remind everybody that commissioners do actually have up till the end of the next Congress to be able to serve once their term expires. So while Commissioner Symington's term technically expires at the end of this year, in June of this year, he has until the end of 2025 before they have to reconfirm him or take other actions. So we should see this grouping. I think the only thing that could potentially change that is depending on what happens with the election. Typically, when the White House switches, you'll see the FCC will switch to the party of the president, with there being a full 5. If the White House were to flip to Republican, it's very likely that Jessica Rosenworcel would vacate the seat so that the new president would be able to appoint somebody for that post. But again, that just depends on what happens with the election. Otherwise, this is our full dais now, and very excited to see that the FCC is able to move forward with, I think, a number of issues that had been sort of sitting there waiting while they were waiting to get past that 2-2 split. Not a lot of changes over at NTIA. We still have Alan Davidson, the Assistant Secretary of Commerce, leading the charge. He's been there since, I believe, January of 2022. Lots of focus over at NTIA separate from the spectrum issues. And I think we heard a little bit about this at the keynote this morning, but NTIA really focused on the BEAD program and the $45 billion of funding that came through for the variety of infrastructure-related projects that the grant funding that they're handling. So lots of efforts there, and lots of efforts related to that, to things like streamlining siting processes. And again, something that was talked about at the keynote this morning. But NTIA really taking a lead role in coordinating some of the permitting processes as well for those grant programs. Charles Cooper, well known in the space, still over there managing the spectrum issues, in particular the National Spectrum Strategy efforts, but also he actually led the interagency efforts for the WRC last year, for WRC 23. And then not on here, but we do have a new addition over at NTIA helping with the National Spectrum Strategy. That's Shiva Goel, who is coming over from the FCC from Commissioner Starks' office. So he is now going to be taking over implementation of the National Spectrum Strategy, following on the very good work that Scott Blake Harris did over the 18 months prior to get that document released. So this slide, as you all know, could be filled with any number of federal agencies. I think agencies have more and more of late sort of figured out that they all have equities in the spectrum space, whether it's protecting the uses that they have, making sure that they can continue those uses, or protecting those uses from new operations that might be in the same band or nearby bands. So just to touch on a few of them, I think first we'll just start with the White House. The White House really does continue to serve that coordinating and convening role. We've seen that with this administration in particular, with a number of sort of holistic strategies that they've developed. The National Cybersecurity Strategy, they had a Bill of Rights on artificial intelligence, and then of course the National Spectrum Strategy as well, which really is, I think, largely focused from the White House perspective on the coordination aspects and having kind of an escalation process for the interagency dialogue. And then, of course, the White House does continue to step in to the extent that there needs to be sort of a heavy hand to resolve some of those disputes that we've seen. The Department of Defense will continue to be an outsized player when it comes to spectrum policy, and actually even more so now with the National Spectrum Strategy. DoD is co-leading some of the studies, and we'll talk about that in a moment. But this follows on some of the elevation of DoD's role in the spectrum management process in terms of allocations and coexistence in evaluations that came out of the 2021 IIJA. So DoD will continue to play an important role, certainly to make sure that their mission systems are protected as we take a look at potentially opening up spectrum bands that are occupied by DoD for potential commercial use. NSF, of course, I would be remiss if I didn't bring them up, given that this is Spectrum Week. The National Science Foundation has a pretty big role, actually, as part of the National Spectrum Strategy in terms of steps that will be taken over the course of the next several years for research and development efforts. Obviously, NSF has been around for 75 years. They know what they're doing in terms of scientific and engineering analyses. So it did make sense to house a lot of those efforts under the NSF umbrella. So you'll see things like the National Research and Development Plan, which NSF is working on now. I think they're talking about that at a workshop on Friday. They'll be managing a values-based modeling effort and best practices there. They'll actually also be managing the National Workforce Development Plan that we'll talk about in a moment, and then the National Dynamic Spectrum Sharing Test Bed, which I think will be a big point of conversation over the next several years. And then Congress, of course, still retains the power of the purse. I think we heard a little bit over at the keynote today about the continuing dispute about the FCC's auction authority, but Congress does continue to play a role in terms of setting the boundaries around what auction authority will look like, whether it will be tied to specific frequency bands and auctions, increasingly whether or not the auction revenues will be used for specific set-aside programs like the ACP, the Affordable Connectivity Program, or the RIP and Replace program, things like that. We do have now sort of dueling bills over in Congress from the leadership over on the Senate side, taking a look at what that auction authority restoration could look like and how that might be packaged. So I believe one of them is actually being marked up later this week. So there's definitely continued efforts on the congressional side, on the spectrum front, not only in terms of taking a look at the auction authority, but again, what might be tied to it potentially moving forward. And then other ones continue to remain substantial players. Department of Transportation, I will just note, does continue to play a substantial role. The FAA, as well as the broader agency on things like connected vehicles, the UAS operations that are part of the National Spectrum Strategy, and a number of other places that DOT has continued to have a voice. So I think I've said the words National Spectrum Strategy about 30 times already, so it probably makes sense to go ahead and go into that slide. So this will look very familiar to folks. The National Spectrum Strategy, development plan is something that was several years in the making, from the conception of it to the request for comment, and then through the release of that in November of 2023. This is something that a number of administrations of past have attempted to do, have released individualized reports. This is a very comprehensive version, not only taking a look at the spectrum pipeline, the long-term planning for what that looks like, but then creating this new vehicle for spectrum innovation, and then again, the workforce and education pieces. Before kind of getting into what those look like, it probably makes sense to just highlight as well that in addition to the National Spectrum Strategy being released in November of 2023, it also was tied to a presidential memorandum on spectrum usage in the United States. And that's a big deal, right, to have the president sort of setting out a policy around what spectrum should look like, specifically calling for the National Spectrum Strategy, which of course was released on the same day. But then I think importantly on the presidential memorandum side, laying out a foundation for more coordination in the interagency process. This is something I think we talked a little bit about last year in terms of some of the disputes that we've seen across different agencies. The FCC makes a band available, for instance, and then the FAA comes in and says we have concerns about potential interference to aircraft, or DoD comes in and says we have concerns about interference to GPS and what have you, and it leads to questions after the fact. Sometimes those are resolved before the FCC acts. Sometimes they come up or they're not realized that there's a potential for harmful interference until the FCC already acts. And so the presidential memorandum actually lays out a pretty clear process for what those escalations kind of look like, both before the FCC acts and then separately if potentials for harmful interference are discovered kind of after the FCC acts as well. So again, the White House kind of putting down that marker, but also really emphasizing and underscoring that interagency process piece, which I think was intended to try to solve some of the problems that we've seen before. So in terms of the strategy itself, again, it's broken into 4 pillars. The overall, is that me? Okay. The overall strategy itself has a goal of taking a look at about 2,500 megahertz of spectrum. That does not mean that 2,500 megahertz of spectrum will be made available for commercial use, but it does open up the opportunity to explore that in a number of different bands. And so I think the 5 key bands, there are 5 key bands rather in the strategy. The first 2 are the ones that kind of get the most attention, the lower 3 gigahertz band and the 7 and 8 gigahertz band. So we'll dig into those in a little bit more detail on the specific slides, but on lower 3 gigahertz, NTIA and Department of Defense will co-lead those studies over the course of the next several years. This is a follow-on from an investigation that was conducted under the PATHS process that resulted in what was called the Embers report that was just released last month. It was actually completed last fall, but it was released in redacted version this past April. And then overall, that spectrum plan is going to take a look at the potential for opening up the lower 3 gigahertz band in some fashion, evaluating sharing, evaluating compression and clearing, and kind of all of the options. The goal is to have that done by October of 2026. That plan for that timeline is contingent on the agencies actually getting their funding to be able to conduct those studies, though. So they have put in those requests for that funding, and the goal is to get that approved by October of this year so that it can be a 2-year study process. Very similarly on 7 and 8, 7125 to 8.4, DoD and the other relevant agencies, depending on the various pieces of the band, will be co-leading the investigations there. 7 and 8 gigahertz, as everybody knows, really is an alphabet soup of agencies, so there are a lot of equities in that space, a lot of agencies that are going to want to be a part of that process, and so again, seeking the funding to be able to develop that through the Spectrum Relocation Fund. Hopefully those funds will be approved by October of this year so that they can have a 2-year study cycle. 3 other bands involved here. The FCC has already been taking a look at the 5030 to 5091 gigahertz band for uncrewed aviation system operations. The National Spectrum Strategy will kind of take a secondary look at that, I believe by spring of next year is when that goal is. But in the meantime, the FCC will be taking action on some preliminary pieces there. 37 to 37.6, the lower 37 gigahertz band. This is actually going to be the first one that is going to move on the National Spectrum Strategy timeline with potential action by this fall. And then not going to be discussed today, but I just want to flag that the 18.1 to 18.6 gigahertz band is also mixed in there. This is going to be studied for expanded federal and non-federal satellite use, consistent with some decisions at WRC 23. I did leave it off of here. Again, I'm sort of keeping a focus on fixed mobile terrestrial services for the most part and across the bands, but wanted to make sure to highlight 18 as well. So that's the spectrum pipeline prong. The long-term planning of spectrum needs, one would think is sort of similar to spectrum innovation, but it kind of touches on a little bit of a different focus area. So the focus here is really that collaboration framework, implementing some of what the presidential memorandum had laid out, but also kind of teeing up some enhanced spectrum planning processes and data collection processes. This is where you're going to see development of that values-based model to inform spectrum decisions. There's also going to be an evaluation of historical reallocated and auctioned bands to kind of inform, future conversations, and then best practices for scientific and economic analyses as well. The spectrum innovation front, I think this is the one is of most interest to NSF and a number of folks here this week. This is really that forward-looking research and development phase. This administration is obviously very keen on dynamic spectrum sharing, and this creates an opportunity for sandboxes and test beds and a number of other evaluations that are going to be taking a look at dynamic spectrum sharing, how it could work, the various different questions around it, modeling assumptions and inputs that might be sort of made uniform. NSF is actually seeking comment on that R&D plan now. The comments came in, they were filed back in March, they were just released a couple weeks ago. We do believe that NSF is looking to finalize that R&D plan by November of this year, and so I think later this week you'll see some further conversation as part of the workshop that they're developing there for what that R&D plan might actually look like. And then finally, expanded spectrum expertise and national awareness is the last of the 4 pillars. It touched on earlier actually about the need for spectrum workforce development, making sure that folks know what spectrum is, they know the importance of it and what uses it, and not only from a policymaker perspective, but from a consumer perspective as well. And then making sure that we have the workforce to build it out and to learn about RF engineering and design and really have those forward thinkers into the next generation. So that's the goal of the workforce and education piece. That actually wasn't even part of the National Spectrum Strategy's request for comment back in April of 23. That was something that NTIA developed based on the comments that they received and the need for having that sort of workforce development. So there is lots of work to do on the National Spectrum Strategy. A lot of that work has already started. Some of it you'll start to see over the course of the next several years, and then again really bleeding into at least 2027, looking at the timeline that was outlined. But I do think that the NTIA and the White House sort of envision the National Spectrum Strategy being an iterative process, so that to the extent that this remains a framework through successive administrations potentially, that's sort of the goal, is to kind of use that as a model for moving forward for all of the pillars that are involved. I was going to actually pause and see if anybody had any questions on that before I moved forward. Okay. Yeah. Sure, and so I have a slide on that actually. So we'll dig in that a little more. But yeah, the FCC already has an item teed up on that. Item on circulation that they'll be moving forward with here shortly, and hope it's on circulation. I don't know how fast they'll actually move forward with it. But then there is a secondary component under study as well. Okay, so band-specific developments. Again, we're going to go up the frequencies here, so you'll kind of see things as they go. Wanted to start out with 900 megahertz. This one is an old proceeding that is bringing up some new components, and so I just wanted to make sure to highlight it for folks. In April of this year, the FCC put out a public notice on a petition that was filed taking a look at the band plan here and whether or not there could be 5x5 megahertz channels moving forward in the 900 megahertz band. This is something that the FCC actually considered back in 2020 whenever it adopted its order making available the 6 megahertz in the 900 megahertz band for narrowband and broadband operations. The FCC had envisioned sort of a market-driven voluntary exchange process to sort of deal with the incumbents in the band. There are parties now, 10 parties, including Anterix, Amarin, Enterprise Wireless Association, and others, who are now asking the FCC to take a look again 4 years later at whether or not we could have 5x5 channels instead of just the 6 megahertz that were made available paired. So the record is just now coming in on this one. There are a lot of equities here, obviously, interested parties both above and below all segments of the 900 megahertz band. The FCC had acknowledged earlier in the proceeding back in 2020 that the American Railroad Association has a nationwide ribbon license in that band as well. And we are now seeing that coming up as part of the comment process here with the American Railroads Association raising concerns not only about interference, but the idea of having to be relocated out of the band under this 5x5 framework. Continue to see development there. The Commission did put it out on public notice. The comments, or the reply comments rather, are due here just in a couple days. So continue to kind of see what happens with that continued request. 2.5, just to wrap up an update from last year. So I think the last time we spoke, T-Mobile was waiting for its licenses. The FCC had moved forward with the auction in July of 2022, finalized that for those overlay licenses in the 2.5 band. About 8,000 licenses, flexible use licenses, were issued. Around March 1st of 2023, the FCC had acted on, I think, 61 out of 62 of the long-form applications that were filed. There was one remaining application, and it held over 7,000 licenses, and that was because T-Mobile won 91% of the licenses in the auction. Then, 5 days later, the FCC's auction authority expired, and so that left the licenses sort of in limbo because it was the FCC General Counsel's determination that the FCC could not issue those licenses without having auction authority. So that conversation continued. There were a lot of research papers and general counsels of lore and yore weighing in from the FCC, really trying to figure out a path forward to getting those licenses issued. Ultimately got those issued as a result of legislation. One-page piece of legislation, the 5G Sale Act, that was enacted in December of last year. That gave the FCC, I think it was a 90-day window, 90-day window for the FCC to finalize processing of those outstanding applications. And so they did that. So as of February of this year, all of the licenses from Auction 108 have been issued, and the FCC's sort of preliminary, or rather small-scale authority there under the 5G Sale Act is complete. So I think that actually just wraps up 2.5 at this point. Lower 3 gigahertz has a lot more conversation to it. We talked about this one. I think we heard about it over there. A number of folks will be talking about this as part of the National Spectrum Strategy as well. The lower 3 gigahertz band is a really prime target for a number of folks, both the incumbents who are there, particularly DoD and the radio location interests, as well as commercial entities that are seeking access to that band. There are a variety of different mechanisms and thoughts on how that band could potentially be made available, whether it's through repacking or compression or relocating some of the systems, or whether it's creating a CBRS-like dynamically shared framework, sort of leveraging the lessons learned from CBRS, but moving forward with that framework as well. All of this has kind of bubbled up with the National Spectrum Strategy, and there will be ongoing studies about that, but it's not the first that we've seen it, right? 2021, the IIJA, the Infrastructure and Jobs Act, required a study of the lower 3 gigahertz band. That led to the PATHS process, which was a multi-year task group effort that was undertaken under the NSC. That included federal stakeholders as well as industry stakeholders of all sides in terms of how folks were looking at making that band available. And that ended up resulting in that EMBERS report that I told you about earlier, the Emerging Mid-Band Radar Spectrum Study. Now, the IIJA, the legislation that led to the PATHS process, the PATHS task group, had a couple of key components to it that really informed how that EMBER study ultimately came out. The IIJA language required a look at whether or not use, federal and non-federal use, could be made available subject to flexible use service roles, and it opened up the opportunity for an auction if there were opportunities for that spectrum to be made available, with that auction by November of 2028. But there were also additional provisions in there that really allowed for a trump card of sorts, to say that if DOD, even after that study was completed, found that their mission would be compromised, that that auction would not move forward. So that ended up resulting in kind of the scope of what the PATHS task group looked at. There was also the analysis of what sharing means for purposes of that study, and DOD's determination was that sharing it for the purposes of the PATHS project for the lower 3 gigahertz band meant not moving, not relocating, not compressing technology, sort of figuring out a way, if possible, to work within where DOD is. And so the study that came out, it was finalized in September of last year, generally consistent with the timeline that Congress mandated. It was not publicly released until just last month. It was in redacted form. Lots of Congresspeople and others kind of trying to push that one forward to get that publicly released. But DOD ultimately determined that sharing is feasible if certain advanced interference mitigation features and coordination frameworks are available. So now, taking that EMBERS report, the National Spectrum Strategy has that as sort of a foundation moving forward with the investigation that is envisioned as part of the National Spectrum Strategy. So again, the National Spectrum Strategy envisions that lower 3 will be studied over the course of the next several years, hopefully by October of 26, but again, depending on whether or not those funding resources are approved. But there is a timeline that's being developed, supposed to be developed by December of this year, and a project plan that'll include coordination or at least engagement with non-federal stakeholders as part of the process. The PATHS group, the task group, is actually being renewed as part of this as well. I believe they're kicking off next week. Mark, I'm looking at you. Yep, they're kicking off next week. So they will be continuing that effort as well. Folks can reapply if they weren't a part of the process before. Even if you were, you still got to reply anyway. But that is going to inform the additional studies. As part of the National Spectrum Strategy, though, the White House and NTIA put some additional parameters around what that study should look like. Now, this study is going to be co-led by NTIA and DOD. So DOD still has a voice in the process and still has an opportunity to engage given the nature of their mission-critical systems in the band. But a couple things that the strategy lays out is to say that the follow-on work also has to consider coexistence sharing and moving systems, compressing the frequency range within the band, additional access below 3.1 gigahertz, and any mechanisms and possibilities with the potential to allow for expanded or more efficient use. So a little bit broader, but again, this will be a multi-year process. It's something that there will be a project plan for, and hopefully folks will have an opportunity to weigh in on, and definitely something that a number of stakeholders are going to be interested in engaging in, certainly. I'm trying to see if I had, yep, I think that's it. Oh, I think one other thing to add, actually, on, interestingly to me, on the National Spectrum Strategy and sort of how that plays in with the IIJA. Again, the IIJA came out in 2021, and it said that if the band could be made available for purposes of commercial use in anywhere in lower 3 gigahertz, that auction had to take place sometime before 2028. The National Spectrum Strategy timeline actually does make room for that. If the studies are completed by 2026, that timeline actually is something that is theoretically achievable. Okay, so 3.45 gigahertz. Not a lot to say on this one at this point. This one has pretty much moved forward with kind of getting the licensing, getting the framework set up, and the relocation clearinghouse as well. So the FCC, there's a lot of history on this one as well. Of course, directly adjacent to the lower 3 gigahertz band and kind of right in the middle and creating, I think Tom Power had mentioned this earlier around, we have questions around what the framework's going to look like in lower 3. Immediately above it, we have full-powered share use. Immediately above that, we have CBRS and very dynamic. And then immediately above that, we have completely cleared full power in C-band. So there's a lot of different frameworks happening in 3 gigahertz right now. 3.45 is kind of one of those sharing hybrids. It is available for full power use in the full 100 megahertz, but there are also cooperative planning areas and periodic use areas that have to be managed with the federal stakeholders in certain kind of geographic zones where they did not vacate, so, or where their systems have to be worked around. So that process is ongoing. The licensees, basically, when they go to light up their systems, have to coordinate directly with the base or the military installation that's in that CPA or PUA where their license is. And then separately, we have the relocation payment clearinghouse that's managing the relocation of the secondary radio location systems out of the band. There were 5 systems, 2 incumbents that were moving their systems out of well below the 3 gigahertz band. It was a nominal amount for purposes of spectrum issues. It was about $300 million. And so the FCC, given kind of on balance the importance of those systems and the amount of money involved, stated that they would allow for reimbursement of that relocation, even though that's not typical for secondary relocations. So as far as we've seen, actually, just yesterday or the day before, Summit Ridge Group updated the docket with their recent report on the status update. Seems to be doing very well. One of the incumbents has already completely cleared their systems and completed their transition. The other one is finalizing. I believe Summit Ridge said they're looking to finalize that process by September of this year. They do seem to be so generally on time and on budget. I wish I could say the same about C-band. C-band is on time. C-band was actually accelerated. So we had a phase 2 accelerated clearing deadline is completed as of December of 2023. This was fantastic news. The wireless licensees, the new flexible use licensees, paid an extra $9 billion or so to get expedited access to that band and have the fixed satellite operators cleared out on a quicker timeline. And all of that is a success. The band has been transitioned. The providers are building that out. There is this secondary component, though, of the relocation payment clearinghouse and sort of how that's going to end, when the money is all going to be dispersed, and how this whole thing is going to wrap up. And there are kind of a couple pieces to that are prolonging the effort a little bit longer than I think probably the licensees would like, because the licensees are funding the relocation payment clearinghouse. But there are some questions around leases associated with some TT&C sites and how long those kind of have to be covered and when those are going to get reimbursed and the claims processed. And then the second component is there is actually an appeal from one of the incumbents around the amount of money that they were reimbursed as part of their transition process. So that appeal is ongoing as well. And so until those things are resolved, it's doubtful that the clearinghouse will wind down. But the FCC did adopt back in December of last year some claims submission deadlines to make sure that that process kind of continues to move forward. February 5th was the submission deadline for all claims as of the end of last year, and then July 1st is the submission deadline for any claims for costs incurred anytime in 2024 or even thereafter, kind of on an estimate basis. I did say, I joke, but the relocation payment clearinghouse is wildly over budget. I think they projected it to be $62 million over the course of a multi-year transition. I believe they're at about $90 million already with several years to go. So again, that's part of the reason I think why some folks were trying to get the FCC to set some deadlines, move the process forward, and get some finalization around that RPC. At this point, the relocation payment clearinghouse is saying maybe June of 2025, but again, those additional components, we'll just have to wait and see. We did talk a lot last year about the FAA issues and the coordination with the radio altimeter operations directly above the C-band. That dispute has largely been resolved. The FAA came out with some airworthiness directives and provided some guidance and requirements for the aviation industry to upgrade their radio altimeters, to retrofit them in certain instances, with a long-term path through 2028 for some additional R&D there to allow for kind of next-generation radio altimeter development as well. So that one is actually largely resolved at this point. I think we are, 4.9. How could I forget 4.9? And the 7th report in order that we are now on for the 4.9 gigahertz band. So again, another one that's very long pending. I think we talked about this one previously. The FNPRM was released last year. FCC here opening up opportunities for non-public safety uses in the band through a leasing mechanism, and asking some questions around what the band manager would look like for that particular band. The record before the FCC at this stage is actually largely focused on whether or not FirstNet has a role to play in the 4.9 gigahertz band, whether or not there should be some sort of coordinated operations as part of the National Public Safety Broadband Network. So I think that continues to be the big focus at this point. We could see action on this one, but definitely a big focus for folks who are following the band manager and kind of how that fits in with FirstNet, the process there. Next is 5030 to 5091. Okay, so going back to the National Spectrum Strategy, the NSS again envisions taking a look at 5030 to 5091, which in some ways was a little surprising because the FCC already has an NPRM on that one, and something that the FCC had been really considering going back to about 2018, when the Aerospace Industries Association had asked the FCC to develop some rules for UAS operations in this band segment. This band segment is internationally harmonized for UAS operations, and the FCC opened up the NPRM to seek comment on making it available in a networked access and non-networked access way, with the non-networked access managed through a dynamic frequency management system. The FCC had indicated, and this is actually in the National Spectrum Strategy, that it was looking to take some near-term steps on this item. We did see that item go on circulation at the FCC. That means that there is an item drafted, and it is basically out in paper copy for the commissioners to look at and vote on. It is not assigned for an FCC open meeting, which means we don't have a copy of the item, unfortunately. But from what we understand, it seems like the FCC is going to move forward with opening up the portions of the band, or at least some portions of the band, for non-networked access, keeping aside some of those networked access issues that are likely to be more prevalent as part of the conversations with the FAA, particularly because that non-networked access tends to be beyond visual line of sight, and that's something that the FAA is continuing to take a look at and likely will have a rulemaking on as well. So lots of coordination on kind of that piece, but in the meantime, it does seem like at least the FCC is going to move forward with some of those non-networked access issues through use of the DF MS, and I guess wait to see what that looks like once the item is actually released. I think that's all I had on that one. 5.9 we can go through pretty quickly. Just to give a quick update here, the FCC has had an item out there since November of 2020, a report and order and an FNPRM. This one had adopted a new band plan for the 5.9 band to allow for unlicensed use in the bottom 45, and then new intelligent transportation services in the top end of the band. There are still some outstanding questions around those operations. The FNPRM in particular has some questions around what cellular V2X technology communications will look like, and kind of how those rules will play out. But in the meantime, the FCC has been acting through waivers to allow for those CV2X deployments to move forward. They have issued, I think, 4 orders at this point. There have been waivers granted in nearly 24 states, about 50 different entities coming to the commission and looking for deployment of both roadside units and onboard units for use of cellular V2X in that 5.9 band. Whatever the FCC does on the final, the rules that are adopted after the FNPRM comes out, the waiver recipients will have to comply with whatever the final rules are, but with there being 50 grants already, it kind of seems like something that perhaps those final rules will tend to stray towards what the waivers have already started to look like. Unfortunately, no sense of timing on that one to announce on this one. 6 gigahertz is always one that we could spend a whole lot of time on. I definitely want to give an update on the AFC certification process from this year. Mark's smiling. He's happy about all the good advancements this year on the AFCs. But there are still some outstanding issues as well, and then we did have some activity back in the fall. So folks will remember this all stems from the November 2020 order opening up the 1200 megahertz at 6 gigahertz for unlicensed use. The FCC, lots of activity related to this, and particularly on the AFC certification for the standard power devices that are operating in the band. We had seen going back to September of 2021, the process began for authorizing the AFC systems. Conditional approval a year later in November of 2022 for 13 of those entities. And then with following up on the testing that was conducted and reported out to OET, finalization and approval of 7 of those AFCs back in February of this year. There was a conditional component of the AFC certifications, the final plan, which is that the certified AFCs had to kind of come together and put together an interference plan so that any of the related incumbents in the band who might experience harmful interference had kind of a mechanism to raise concerns. So that was set up through the website afcoperators.org, information that the stakeholders, the incumbents in the band who might have concerns, kind of input their information. That information gets relayed to the FCC and potentially the Enforcement Bureau and kind of analyzed as part of that process. But that portal access is reserved for the authorized users of the 6 gigahertz band. So that piece, I think, great in terms of kind of closing out one of the long outstanding items there and certainly moving forward with the standard power access to the band. One of the other questions that had come out of the April 2020 item were questions around very low power access as well. The Commission had opened up the opportunity for standard power use in the Uni 5 and the Uni 7 segments. They had opened up unlicensed low power access points for indoor use throughout the band, but then there were questions around whether or not there should be very low power operations enabled as well. And so the FCC did act on that piece of the FNPRM back in November of last year. They adopted rules permitting very low power devices only in the Uni 5 and Uni 7 segments, largely recognizing that that's just where the nature of the record was in terms of where folks had kind of focused their attention on the issues. But they did indicate that the second FNPRM, rather, that was included as part of that is asking questions around continuing to expand that very low power access to the other 2 segments, to the Uni 6 and the Uni 8 bands. There are still pending, in addition to that, there's pending questions around client-to-client devices. And then the April 2020 FNPRM still has other issues that were attached to it. The FCC back in November said that they intend to address those remaining issues in a further notice at a later time. So unclear when that will be, but there are still questions. Things like increased transmit power for indoor devices, standard power mobile operations, and then whether to have higher powers permitted for the standard power access points when they are configured as point-to-point links. So lots of questions still open, lots of pieces were resolved. Would absolutely expect to continue to see movement on the 6 gigahertz band in the year ahead. 7 and 8 gigahertz is another one that obviously gets a lot of attention, and more so now that it's part of the National Spectrum Strategy. I joked earlier that it's sort of an alphabet soup of a band, but it really is. It has pretty much every type of federal use one can imagine. It's fixed, it's mobile, it's FSS and MSS, it's space research and Earth exploration. So lots of different equities here in terms of the uses that the federal agencies are engaged in, and then of course the varied agencies as well. And so the National Spectrum Strategy envisions that those players, the agencies that have uses in the band, will have a voice as part of the spectrum evaluation here. The 7 and 8 gigahertz band is largely on the same timeline as the 3 gigahertz band. So those agencies are submitting their requests for funding now, hopefully approved by October, getting the plans, the project plans approved by the end of the year, and then hopefully finalizing those reports by October of 2026. I think taking a look at the National Spectrum Strategy, one of the things that I thought was really interesting was the implementation plan record. The FCC, you'll recall that NTIA actually put out a implementation plan notice as well, so kind of broad frameworks around the National Spectrum Strategy, and then the implementation plan was what gave a lot more of those details around timelines and agencies and kind of how all of the different players would be engaged. And one of those pieces was putting it out for comment. And the record on the 7 and 8 gigahertz band was absolutely fascinating. It was probably, like, for geeks like me who like to look at that stuff at least, it was interesting to see how many people, how many different groups of interested parties had different ideas about what should happen with that band. So we had commercial wireless stakeholders looking for licensed full power access to at least some of the band. Wi-Fi, looking for extending the 6 gigahertz band up a little bit in a near-term basis to complete another 320 megahertz channel, taking a look at the rest of the band for unlicensed or dynamically shared use. You had ultra-wideband interests looking to have some sort of protection, which was interesting. You had X-band users and Earth exploration services that were actually looking for their segments to be excluded altogether. A number of utilities and critical infrastructure, particularly, and other fixed service providers obviously were very interested in this one, trying to figure out how this would play out and what mechanisms would be used. Satellite stakeholders looking for additional access to the band as well. So pretty much everyone had something to say about 7 and 8. So this study will be really interesting, not only with the depth of the federal agencies involved, but recognizing the depth of the commercial stakeholders that are going to be interested in this band as well. So I talked about the timeline, talked about the scope. The scope is generally consistent with 3 gigahertz as well. So taking a look at the various ways of sharing and to include relocation, compression, those sorts of things. I think the only other thing to note on this one is that 7 and 8 gigahertz is also being discussed internationally. And we will probably see how those pieces kind of start to play out as the Department of State and the FCC's WRC Advisory Committee start to figure out what the U.S. positions are going to be. That all is going to be timed right around the same time as when the report should be coming out on 7 and 8. So they very much should be informing each other, or likely will inform each other in terms of the question that's outstanding for the WRC 27 agenda around whether or not to make international mobile telecommunications use of some or all of the 7 and 8 gigahertz band. 10 gigahertz, I just wanted to keep this up as a reminder, but not actually any activity in the last year on this one. That would have been my fault for touching that microphone. Sorry, I was checking my time. The FCC here has a petition for rulemaking out in front of it, taking a look at whether or not there could be point-to-point use on a shared basis in the 10 gigahertz band. This one is actually interesting because it's an issue that was raised about a decade ago by Mimosa Networks. What the new petition, the October 2022 petition, has to its benefit is advancements in shared management systems, because they were able to kind of take the concept that Mimosa Networks had come up with, but now leverage the idea of utilizing an AFC for those fixed point-to-point systems for a shared use. So not out on comment yet, but it is one that continues to remain sort of out there for potential action. 12 gigahertz, the FCC did move forward on this one. It adopted its orders related to the 12.2 and 12.7 gigahertz bands. The commission had actually teed up the 12.7 to 13.25 for exclusive use, but the record is very much filled with folks looking to potentially make that band available for shared use, and then also satellite interests looking for potential expanded FSS opportunities as well. So definitely one to keep an eye on in terms of whether or not the FCC pivots from the initial proposal that it had based on the record that it has before it on that band. Lower 37 is one, and we skipped past 18 again. Remember, 18 is on the National Spectrum Strategy list, but not in our cards. Lower 37 is, though. Lower 37 has 600 megahertz at 37 to 37.6. The FCC opened that up all the way back in July of 2016 as part of the original Spectrum Frontiers order. That was tied with a number of other bands that were made available. Many of them have already been auctioned. But there is kind of this open question of what the framework is going to look like for the 600 megahertz of spectrum that's shared on a federal, non-federal basis. The FCC did seek additional comment on that back in 2018, but largely hasn't done anything in terms of what that framework's going to look like since. So the National Spectrum Strategy really is a driving force for this band. It's actually the first one on the time scale with potential action by November of this year. There are a lot of different ideas around what that sharing framework could look like. The FCC had put out there a first-come, first-serve site-based licensing process. They put out the idea of registration with different types of licenses. There were suggestions in the record about using the 70, 80, 90 gigahertz framework. So left to be seen, but there are work groups now being developed as part of the National Spectrum Strategy to move that forward. And then resolution on this band segment could actually inform just up the band on 42 gigahertz, where folks have been saying it makes sense to kind of have a similar framework as well. One I actually actually think Dr. Willis might have been the one who asked me a question about this last year on 70, 80, 90 and why was this stalled. So 70, 80, 90, we did finally see activity on this one in January of 2024. 3 bands here. The FCC has obviously had its framework for this band for 20 years, give or take, non-exclusive licenses, coordinated registration of the individual links. Back in 2020, the FCC had opened up an NPRM seeking comment on adopting new rules to kind of enhance the framework for that band, also seeking comment on changes to the antenna standards for the 70 and 80 gigahertz bands to facilitate wireless backhaul. In addition to those 2 pieces, which in some ways were relatively straightforward, the NPRM also sought comment on some requests around point-to-point links to endpoints in motion, in particular on airplanes and cruise ships. So that then kind of created some additional complexities around what the resolution should be. The FCC added to that complexity by refreshing the record, quote unquote, in 2021 by mixing in high altitude platform systems as well. And so 4 kind of big questions around those specific bands. The FCC ultimately did adopt its order, taking a look at those rules, adopting the rules for the allowing the point-to-point links for endpoints in motion. They have a further notice that kind of takes a look at some additional questions on that. And then they did also adopt changes to facilitate use of the 70 and 80 gigahertz bands for backhaul. One of the other questions in the FNPRM has to do with potential registration of fixed satellite systems in the band as well. So that's one that's currently out for comment May 29th, end of this month, and then June as well for the commission seeking comment on those 2 issues. I've talked a lot. And I think that's the last one of my band slides. It is. It is. So before we get into auction authority, are there any questions on any of the specific bands? Yeah.
So you mentioned that the payment clearinghouse for 3.7 is over budget.
Yeah.
Is that the Summit Ridge Group or is that a separate activity?
That's a separate group. Summit Ridge Group is doing great on 3.45 on time, largely on budget. Cohen Resnick is running the C-band clearinghouse, but they're doing it kind of in a consortium with a number of law firms and other groups. Yeah. Okay. So other developments, not band specific, but a couple things I just wanted to touch on with folks I think I have 5 more minutes, give or take, yes? Okay. So the FCC Auction Authority we talked a lot about. This is the first time that the FCC has been without auction authority in the 30 years since it had it. That's why it's such a big deal, right? If the FCC doesn't have auction authority, it can't move forward with making additional bands available in a competitive bidding fashion. It does, though, retain some small pieces of authority. We talked about the 5G Sale Act. That allowed the FCC to move forward with getting those 2.5 licenses out the door. We talked about the IIJA, which still has that 3 gigahertz component to the extent that the National Spectrum Strategy kind of opens that up. And then even back in 2015, there's the Spectrum Pipeline Act that called for 30 megahertz below 3 gigahertz. That was supposed to be identified 2 years ago, though, and it was supposed to be auctioned by this year. So that one's not going to happen. The FCC's OEA, the Office of Economics and Analytics, put out a report, a congressionally mandated report last fall that basically said there's no way we're going to meet this one. But it is still out there. The authority does still exist for that 30 megahertz. But in the meantime, lots of activity in Congress on what to do with the auction authority piece. We have a number of pieces of legislation. Again, you talked a little bit about this in the pipeline context, but the Cantwell bill and the Cruz bill, kind of on both sides of the Senate, each of them would take a look at extending the FCC's auction authority kind of on different timelines. I think the Cantwell bill is till fiscal year 2029 at this point. The Cruz bill is until fiscal year 2027. Not sure if either of them will move. There are a lot of questions around, if you do restore the FCC's auction authority, should you tie it to specific bands? If you do tie it to a specific bands or you don't, should you set aside some of the money from the auctions for specific priorities? And so the Cantwell bill in particular kind of follows the track of the National Spectrum Strategy, and it has funding priorities for a number of different R&D efforts. It also has funding for RIP and Replace and the Affordable Connectivity Program. The cruise bill doesn't have quite as many of those components, but it really remains to be seen kind of what happens next. But I think there is still a concerted effort to try to get the FCC's auction authority restored, so that when we do move forward with some of these bands, potentially from the National Spectrum Strategy, or even the 12 gigahertz band or something like that, that the FCC has the tools that it needs in its toolkit to be able to make that happen. And I'm not going to go into depth in these ones, but I did just want to make sure to flag for folks that they're, oh yeah, go ahead.
Auction authority, do you think it's likely to be general or very band specific?
So it's kind of a mix right now. The conversations are kind of a mix right now. The cruise bill is basically a huge swath of spectrum. I want to say it's like 1.3 all the way up to 13.2 or 2.5, where a certain amount of spectrum has to be auctioned within that range. The Cantwell bill specifically includes the 12.7 gigahertz band, but it also includes evaluation of the 7 and 8 gigahertz band as well. So it's kind of a mix, right? I think that's actually part of what the hiccups have been. Folks have been trying to tag in the lower 3 gigahertz band into the auction authority, which created a lot of uproar because folks took a look at the Embers report and said we're not doing exclusive licensing there, so wait until the National Spectrum Strategy comes out. So that was definitely a big piece of the hiccups there. I think folks would prefer it to have something attached to it, right? But it's unclear kind of what that might end up looking like, if at all. Okay, so yeah, a couple related proceedings that I know folks are probably keeping an eye on. The unassigned auctioned spectrum item is a public notice that the commission put out on its inventory spectrum, basically saying, look, we don't have authority to auction anything right now, but we have a bunch of licenses in our inventory, either that were returned for selective defaulting, or that just weren't sold in the initial auctions when they were put on the block. And so what can we do with that spectrum? And so that's kind of the crux of that public notice. People had ideas around special temporary authority or potentially leasing, shared access in those bands, lots of questions about, kind of what do you do with bespoke or, geographically limited inventory spectrum that might be floating out there. So I think those questions remain. Non-federal spectrum usage, this was interesting. NOI, you could see some follow-on from that. Kind of an academic exercise in some ways to try to figure out how does the commission kind of quantify and look at whether spectrum is being used. That is a very loaded question that I know everybody in this room understands how complicated it can be. So it really was an interesting record to take a look at in terms of folks kind of taking a look at what spectrum usage means. Supplemental coverage from space, that actually, the order and FNPRM, just to close out the loop there, that the commission is opening up opportunities for use of terrestrial spectrum by satellite operators in a leasing fashion, just certain terrestrial bands, but just kind of, again, to the idea of coming up with new and novel ways to use the frequencies. This is certainly one of them. I added mobile spectrum holdings on there just to note that there are outstanding questions around what the spectrum screen looks like. Folks have raised a lot of questions around whether or not the wireless industry is competitive enough and kind of whether or not there needs to be a reevaluation of the spectrum screen, how you account for certain mid-band frequencies that are not included in there. So lots of questions there that are outstanding as of the end of last year. Open Internet I put on there. I know folks have a lot of things to say about it, and folks have been following this one for decades, literally. But I only put it on there to say that there were a lot of questions in that record around network slicing, whether or not that sort of falls within the conduct standards that the FCC adopted under the Open Internet rules. The FCC basically punted, did not say one way or the other whether network slicing counts as a biased service for purposes of its reclassification and the conduct standards that it adopted, but it did say it will be closely monitoring that issue. So definitely one that I think a lot of folks in the terrestrial wireless space will be keeping an eye on. And then finally, digital discrimination. I did want to make sure to flag for this group as well. This one might seem unrelated. The FCC adopted rules prohibiting intentional and unintentional discrimination in the deployment of broadband. The reason, unless you have a quote-unquote genuine issue of technology or economic feasibility. The reason that I bring it up is because there is a very sweeping scope in terms of who the digital discrimination rules apply to. It doesn't just apply to broadband entities like the service providers that you would think about. It actually applies to a much broader group, really anyone that is touching the broadband space. So that's definitely one that folks should be keeping an eye out in terms of the covered entities as well as the scope. It talks about pricing and speeds and data caps and network infrastructure deployment that enables the broadband deployment as well. So those rules went into effect in March of 2024, except for some questions around when the sort of investigations process might start. But yeah, that's definitely one to keep an eye out as well, because it seems to be touching not just broadband providers themselves, but infrastructure deployment providers, folks in the space that are connected. So that is it. And I've been asking questions throughout, but I will ask again. Does anyone have any questions?
Any quick thoughts on that increased power potential for the indoor 6 gig low power, not becoming low power?
Yeah. So I honestly don't. I haven't been following it closely enough. Certainly a lot of equities there. Lots of folks will be very interested, not only the incumbents in the band, but also the adjacent band users, particularly the cellular V2X as well. So I don't know where it's going to land, but it'll definitely be, I would say it would probably be like everything else in the 6 gigahertz band, which is a paperwork exercise, and we'll just have to see what happens. Yeah.
On the cellular V2X
Yeah.
wafers, are all those wafers implementing the same technologies?
So there are certain rules that have to be met, and then each one of the waivers kind of complies with the original one. So they're all the same in the sense of what technical rules they have to comply with, specific to either the onboard units or the roadside units, depending on which entity is requesting it and what they're using it for. But each successive one has kind of built back off the original. Yeah.
I just want to say excellent presentation.
Oh, thank you. I appreciate it.
Supposed to be there clapping, but before publicly, I presented a couple of them, even though I thought I knew anything about them. It's certainly
Wonderful.
excellent.
Oh, thank you.
Everything will be posted
There
on
we
the
go.
NSMA website.
And connecting it with international,
Well, I appreciate that. They put my video up last year, so you can go back and look at that one too.
All be available.
There we go.
All the NSMA attendees.
Well, I appreciate it. Thank you all very much.
That's truly excellent, Kara. Thank you. Quite a gem. A lot of details, a lot of facets. We'll be back with our 6 gigahertz panel after the break. So look forward to seeing you there. Always peppy. Thank you.